So it's my very great pleasure now to welcome Drs Richard Gameson and Andy Beeby to speak to us. I've known you two guys for quite a while now because of my involvement with History Department at Durham on other projects long before this. And I have to say that it's Rich and Andy are two of the nicest, kindest people I know. So it's always a pleasure to have them involved. But they're also blooming good at what they do. Richard at the close analysis and theorization about early books, mostly in manuscripts, I think, but your history of the book project perhaps takes you further than that occasionally. But if you ever wanted someone to pick up a medieval manuscript and just look at it and share thoughts with you, Richard would be the man. And Andy, I mean, it was such a surprise to suddenly find that Richard's running mate was a chemist. Somebody using skilled at building lab equipment and machines which interrogate things and analyze things. And I was totally converted to Andy when he explained that he'd modified his iPhone in order to be able to analyze the pigments of things that it was looking at. I mean, this has to be seriously cool. And together they are Team Pigment. And nobody really else has worked as much as they have on just what were the pigments used in medieval manuscripts, how are they used, and what does that tell us about the book and the people who are making it and reading it. So 3 cheers for Team Pigment, and that they accepted the invitation to use their skills and indeed their equipment, which is wonderfully portable. So sort of on various trains trying to get down from Durham to Hereford, bits of kit arrived and were assembled with wonderful results. And they're going to speak to us on how the journey took us from the Hereford Gospels now to the Hereford palimpsest Psalter. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much. So we'll attempt to share our screen with you. Bear with us. Hopefully that is now visible. Indeed. Hopefully, yep.
Yeah, that's there.
Brilliant. Okay, off we go. So I'm going to chat first about the Hereford Gospels in general, recapitulating a few things you've heard, but giving a general introduction to the manuscript, why it's important, some of its interesting features. I'll then hand over to Andy, who will comment on some of the analyses we've done, and then I'll come back at the end to comment in particular on what we were able to discover about the palimpsest Psalter. So there you are. There's the beginning of John's Gospel from the Hereford Gospels. The Gospels, it's a great treasure because of its age, its relative completeness. As you've heard, only a couple of pages are missing, whereas many of the more famous counterparts lack far more of their text, and because of its provenance. It's a very rare survivor from West Mercia or Wales, and it's also important because of its many unique features, which I will quickly run through. We've thought about the size, but it's the smallest of the mid-range insular gospel books. Gospel books from this period fall into 3 groups. There are the large, showy ones like the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Kells. At the other extreme, there are very small ones, aptly named pocket gospel books, because they would comfortably fit into your pocket. Between those 2 poles, there's another mid-sized group, and of that mid-sized group, which could arguably be used for either purpose, just small enough to carry around, but big enough to be used for services, and of that group, the Hereford Gospels is the smallest. It's easy to hold and use, and the way it's written, we've heard about the script in some detail, it's very clear. The script is small, but not unduly compressed, ideal for reading, be it one person to hold or for it to be held by a deacon for someone else to read from. The text itself of the Hereford Gospels comprises only the Gospels. Many early Gospel books had ancillary matter, prefaces to each of the 4 Gospels, chapter lists, chapter summaries, summarising the content of divisions within the Gospels, things like canon tables that showed the relationship of content between the 4 Gospels. The Hereford Gospels has none of this, just the Gospel text itself, and that's something that it has in common with Irish manuscripts rather than other Anglo-Saxon books. The text itself, the nature of the text, is not the Vulgate, the most common version of the early and high Middle Ages. About 9/10 of its content is Vulgate, and 1/10 is non-Vulgate. And this is not uncommon in early medieval books, as they were rather like Chinese whispers, copied from one, from another, from another. They grew their own family versions of the texts. Of the 1/10 that isn't Vulgate within the Hereford Gospel text, about 40% is recognizable as what's known an Old Latin text. That's translation preceding the Vulgate. And the other changes are changes of spelling, of tense, of particles, of word order that reflect idiosyncrasies in the copying process. Now, if we're looking for parallels, where do we find the closest match for this particular type of text? The answer is there's no particular close match. Only about 80% of the variant readings in this book can be matched anywhere. But those that can be matched all fall within a particular group of relatives, and almost all of them are Irish. So you're seeing here the MacRagle Gospels made in Birr in County Offaly shortly before 822. It is one of the group that shares a reasonable number of unusual readings with the Hereford Gospels. St Gallen 51, you've seen that already. Dimmer, six other Irish Gospel books, and one possibly from Wales or possibly from Western England, the Lichfield or Chad Gospels. This group, they have about an 80% agreement, so not hugely close, but much closer than any others. So here we're looking at distant relatives rather than close relatives. As you've heard, the text was marked up with crosses. Two of these crosses appear within the text, showing an intimate association with the writing of the original text and marking it up for lections. Now, about 80 passages are marked up for reading in this way. The beginning of the lection is shown by a cross. There's nothing to indicate the end of the lection. And we have schedules of readings that were used in Northumbria, in the Frankish Church, so in Gaul, and in the Roman Church in the early Middle Ages. And what is striking is that there's a very low overlap between the passages marked up in the Hereford Gospels and those in all the other early known lection schemes. So the Northumbrian lection series has 40 readings, only 12 of those appear in Hereford. The Gallican French system has 122 readings, only 25 of those appear in the Hereford Gospels. The Roman system could number up to 300, and only 37 of those appear in Hereford. So it's a very distinctive system of readings. And while some of the things, like the Passion narratives, are what you would expect, there's a real emphasis on the teaching of Christ in the readings that are selected and marked up in the Hereford Gospels itself. The text, as we've seen, was densely written and economically written, yet clear. In the Hereford Gospels, it's block text. So you've got it as a solid block of text with initials marking sentences and divisions within that block. This is in striking contrast to other contemporary methods of setting out the text. What you've got here is a Wearmouth Jarrow Gospel book from the early 8th century, and it's set out what to our eyes looks like verse. This is a system per colorectometer, that's the posh name for it, meaning that it's set out in sense units. So it looks like verse. That's one method of setting out gospel text to facilitate reading in sense units. Another was just setting it out in paragraphs. That, for instance, was used in the Book of Durrow. The Hereford Gospels, you'll remember, is just a block text, but the use of initials clarifies where you divide and how it's subdivided. And there, an example you've already seen, easy to navigate. You've heard a bit about the script, midway between a majuscule script and a minuscule script, so a formal insular minuscule. But what is the most striking thing to bear in mind about it is that it's although it's generically related to scripts in contemporary books, this particular hand and this particular grade of script is almost unparalleled elsewhere. So we've already seen there's an unusual series of lections. We're now seeing that it's an uncharacteristic type of script to use for a book of this nature. There were originally 4 decorated gospel incipits, as you've seen. Here you're looking at Matthew. 3 of them survive, not Luke. And there was also a decorated Chi-Rho page. That's Matthew 1:18, which, and I'm sure this will leap to everybody's mind as soon as I say Matthew 1:18. That's the first mention of Christ's name in the Gospels and the beginning of the sort of narrative after the genealogy. Now, the Chi-Rho is lost, but some impression of what it probably looked like is given by St. Gallen 51, an Irish gospel book that's reasonably closely related to the Hereford Gospels in other ways. So Hereford's version would not have been as elaborate as this, but it gives some sense of a likely design from a book that's broadly akin to Hereford in other ways. When we look at the surviving designs, they're bold. There's a certain lack of finesse, but they're nevertheless bold. And what we can see within the design, particularly of the Mark and the John initials, is a hint of a cross-carpet page and certainly a cross. So at the space between those 2 uprights, you can see the little cross shape defined by bosses. Those bosses themselves remind us of carpet pages such as that in the Book of Kells that you're seeing here, but ultimately they clearly define a cross, highly relevant to the subject of the Gospels themselves. As has already been mentioned, we have looked at the pigments in the book. We've analysed them. Andy will probably say a little bit more about that in due course. The pink is organic. The browns are different versions of gallotanic inks, which can be blacker, as you see here for some of the display script, or browner for some of the interlace. The yellow is orpiment, arsenic sulfide, yellow arsenic sulfide, poisonous. And what's clear from the way it's used in the book is their supplies were limited. So if we go back, we can see that here at the beginning of Mark, it's being used relatively densely, but actually elsewhere more exiguously. And since your supplies of arsenic sulfide come from volcanic regions, and presumably wherever this was made, be it in the Borders or in Wales, they didn't have Amazon to be able to demand new supplies when they needed them. Here we can see they've exhausted or nearly exhausted the small supplies available to them and are trying to eke it out. An interesting lack of decoration, suggesting again a modest centre of production, is that most insular manuscripts use red dots throughout their texts, and initials are typically outlined with red dots. That isn't the practice at all in the Hereford Gospels itself. So it stands apart from other early British manuscripts: unusual text type, a not particularly characteristic method of production, an unusual hybrid script, a unique lection system, and it's entirely unique in having another book buried within it. And studying the manuscript in the 1990s, I became aware that 2 pages in particular had traces of earlier text buried within them. And here at the bottom of the page, in the lower margin, you can see the most that becomes visible to the naked eye, just tram lines running faintly across the page as a whole. And Rosemary Firmin, librarian at the time, she found another page very, very close within the book to this one. And in fact, there you're looking at the final choir of Luke's Gospel, and the slightly bolder leaves there are the palimpsest leaves. So you've got 1 bifolium and 1 singleton. Now, that's fine. Under good light, you can see that there's something there. As we've heard, under ultraviolet light, you can just about make out there are individual letters, and you can incidentally create cataracts for yourself while you're doing it. So not something to be recommended. What were these leaves from? Recovering them, in these circumstances is not in any sense a trivial task. And at that point, I will hand over to Andy, who will tell you about our toolkit for processing and examining manuscripts.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks also, David, for your kind introduction as me as a chemist to the audience. So, Richard and I started collaborating as part of Team Pigment to apply scientific methods to the identification of pigments in manuscripts. And prior to our work, some people had been doing work on local collections, but more often than not, people would look at a book and through connoisseurship and experience, pronounce that a pigment was lapis lazuli or red lead or whatever, simply based on look. As a scientist, I have to have hard data, hard facts in order to identify materials. And for that, we have to have some scientific instrumentation to apply to the questions. Now, the instrumentation, one of the criteria that became immediately apparent to me is that it has to be non-contact, non-invasive, non-damaging. So we don't leave any mark or sample taken from the manuscript. We leave no damage on the manuscript. That is incredibly important. It's important because when we first started doing this, our technology was limited. And over the simple decade that we've been working, the technology has advanced so much that I envisage in another 10 or 20 years, my students will have tools that I can't dream about now. And so it's important they have the same manuscript undamaged to look at using their new technologies. You'll see on the page here, this on the left-hand side, point measurements. These are scientific techniques that we can analyze the composition of the inks or pigments on the page on a small area. In the top there, we've got Raman spectroscopy. We don't need to talk about the detail of that. Happy to answer questions rather later. But it gives us a unique fingerprint for chemicals in a very small area, smaller than the head of a pin. Similarly, the X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, can tell us about the metals present. And in particular, in a gospel manuscript such as this, we may be looking at some gilding, or we may be looking at the metal content of the ink. We've heard that the gallatanic ink contains iron. Sometimes it can contain other metals, such as copper and zinc, as well as adventitious impurities. And so we can analyze that to see what the ink is made of. The bottom technique, FORS, is the acronym. Scientists love acronyms. I apologize for this. It's fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy. And it simply gives us a reflectance spectrum of the object to give us the composition again and the fingerprint for some pigments. It's unequivocal. It's unique spectrum that we record for the material on the page. On the right-hand side, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the imaging techniques that we've been using. And primarily here, we've been using the multispectral imaging, or MSI, to reveal the palimpsest of pages in the manuscript. And I'll explain a little bit more detail how that works in a second. We can also do 3D scanning, which is the top there. When there was a question earlier about can we see dry point and so forth. 3D scanning using either photometric stereo or RTI, reflectance transform imaging. Those techniques can give us the surface texture of the page. And in fact, we have applied that to the palimpsest of pages of the gospel. We haven't put in the slides here, but they're going to appear in an article shortly, where you can see the difference in texture of the surface of the page between the palimpsest of pages and the original non-palimpsest of pages. And then finally, we have something called hyperspectral imaging, which is just a little bit bigger and better than multispectral, but there are some reasons we chose the multispectral imaging for this particular job. So this is a picture of the kit in operation. What you'll see is me here. This is actually in the basement, in the boiler room of the cathedral, or the library rather. The reason we're doing it here is because we can switch all the lights off and be operating in the dark. And essentially, the key components here, I hope you can see the cursor. There's a camera sitting at the top, which is, it looks like a regular digital camera, but it's one that's been heavily modified and expensively modified to be able to see a wider spectrum. It can see beyond what the human eye can see. And then there's a filter wheel. Again, just find my cursor. A filter wheel here, which is selecting the color of light that the camera sees. The book sits on a cushion below the object, and then there are LED panels that give light to illuminate the book for the photography. And using this equipment, we can take photographs of the manuscript through the visible and beyond the visible spectral range. So everyone's got a mobile phone. If you look at your mobile phone and take a photograph with it, what it does is record 3 images, a red, a green and a blue image. And these RGB images, as we refer to them, essentially made up of 3 slices, will give us the color that the human eye sees. So they can be reprocessed to display a photograph that would mimic what our eye would see looking at the original. Our multispectral imaging system, though, looks not just at 3 images, but in fact at 16 plus a few others. And with that, we can see in the ultraviolet region. Richard mentioned people work under ultraviolet light sometimes to read erased text. With our system, we can take photographs that you can then reprocess later. So the book is exposed to a whole lot less ultraviolet light, which can be damaging to parchment. So it's essentially a far nicer and easier way, both on the manuscript and on the human eye. And we also extend beyond the red portion of the spectrum into what we call the near infrared. Again, invisible to the human eye, but it can reveal some really interesting information about the pigments and dyes on the page. So how do we see palimpsests? When we look at a manuscript, if we have here a piece of parchment shown with a grey block, on the new text, or the text that we can see by eye, we shine visible light onto the object, and the visible light is absorbed by the black or brown galvatanic ink. And so no light is reflected from that small area, and what we see is a dark patch. Plain parchment, on the other hand, reflects light, and we see the lighter colour of the parchment. And sometimes when you've got erased text, depending on how vigorously the text has been erased, whether it's been washed or scraped, or even the parchment thinned down in those regions, you may see evidence of a shadow, but because there's less ink on the page, less light has been absorbed, and therefore we don't see a pronounced letter that we can read easily. On the other hand, if we go to the ultraviolet spectral region, well, the new text, the new ink, this absorbs ultraviolet light, and so again, no light is reflected. So new text would appear dark. Plain parchment tends to fluoresce somewhat, so we shine ultraviolet light on the page, and we see blue fluorescence or green fluorescence from the parchment. It's a natural process brought about by molecules in the parchment, in the skin of the animal. It's a natural thing. Where you have erased text, though, remember the erased text contained iron at some point, and some of the iron leached out of the galvatanic ink into the parchment. And where the iron is now in the animal skin, what we see is a shadow, because that iron quenches the fluorescence. It reduces the intensity of fluorescence from the parchment. So by looking at, for example, UV-induced fluorescence images along with the visible images, we can sometimes see text that has been erased. So at that point, I'm going to pass back to Richard, who's going to show some of the magnificent pictures that Bill has managed to process from these data.
So this is just reminding you of the various frequencies that we recorded the images. What do you then get? Even with optimal technology and the best modern processing, there is a problem. Now, I'm sure most people are familiar with the famous Archimedes palimpsest and so on, miraculous recoveries. Without minimizing what they did, they had a slightly easier task than we had, because typically ancient ink was carbon-based, whereas medieval ink was galvatanic or tannin-based. And you are therefore trying to separate out 2 chemically quite different things. The problem with the Hereford palimpsest is that the underwriting was done in exactly the same ink as the overwriting. So in principle, what you do to enhance the one will just enhance the other. And later today, Bill will explain how with the images we were able to supply him and a lot of artistry, as well as science and computing, he was able to supply me with a range of different degrees of illumination of the undertext in relation to the overtext, and eventually I was able to read a certain amount of it. You can see that the other problem is that the Hereford Gospel text itself was densely written over the central area of the page, and so all one will ever be able to see there are little bits of letters that sneak around the overtext. So there's an element of art and puzzle solving alongside the science here. But fortunately, where the text extended into the margins, it becomes more visible. And on this page, you can see a couple of lines or 3 lines in the lower margin, and there was sufficient visible round the sides of the gospel text block for me to recognize that what we had here were pages from a Psalter. And we've got parts of Psalms 68 to 72, including the beginnings of 3 of them. And I'm showing you 2 of the beginnings there, so you can see the larger elaborated initial heading the beginning of the psalm. It's a real shame we didn't have the start of Psalm 68. We didn't. And the reason for that is that Psalm 68 was a liturgically significant psalm. And if the Psalter had been used liturgically, Psalm 68's incipit, the beginning of Psalm 68, would have been marked or enlarged or enhanced in some way or another, and that would have provided us with key information about the potential use of this particular Psalter. But unfortunately, fate did not shine upon us, and that bit wasn't preserved. So the bits that we have left were originally designed to fit together like this. So you can see that 93 and 96 and 100 are what survive. And originally they formed, 2 of them formed bifolia, and there was another singleton. And what's interesting here is that this older book, the Psalter, was also constructed from irregular quires. So typically you tried to make books with a single sheet of parchment folded in half, as you've heard. That makes a nice strong structure. If you were being economical, you might use smaller offcuts of parchment and they would become half a sheet. And that's what you can see was the case here. And exactly the same is true of the Hereford Gospels, where single sheets, half sheets, are common. So something pointing to a close alliance between these 2 parts of the book itself. If we go back to, I'll explain what you're seeing here in a second. If it looks slightly odd, that's because it is slightly odd. Of what I could read of the text, there were 14 diagnostically Gallican readings and only 1 Roman reading. Now, what am I talking about? There are 3 Latin translations of the Psalter, and what we have here, and often individual copies would be not purely one or purely the other, but clearly the main text here was predominantly a Gallican text. And why is that interesting? Because we only have 3 early Psalters that survive, 3 and a bit early Psalters that survive from Anglo-Saxon England, and they've all got Roman texts. We only have 2 Irish Psalters from the same period, and they both have Gallican texts. So the Hereford palimpsest Psalter's text aligns itself with either the Irish or a further Western tradition, not with the Anglo-Saxon norms of the time. What was also very clear from the bits that I could read was that it had not been well copied, and there were numerous anomalies and 3 certain errors, even in the small bits that I could read. And what you're actually looking at here is the scribe giving up. Now, if you look in the lower margin, the writing is actually back to front. The palimpsest there is back to front, and the initial, which you've seen on one of the earlier slides, that looks here like a P, is actually a Q. You're seeing it reversed because we're looking through the leaf. You'll remember that the processing is enhancing what's been lost, but whose ions have penetrated and embedded in the parchment. And we can see that from the back of the leaf rather than from the front of the leaf. What does that tell us? There is nothing on this side of the leaf. And in fact, the scribe stopped writing on this side of the leaf with at least 4 lines spare. He just broke off. And the only reason you would do that is that you've decided you've made too many errors, you can't correct them, and so you're going to reject these leaves. And the density of errors, the irregularities, which you'll see in due course, and the fact that the scribe breaks off without finishing a page strongly suggest that all these leaves were reject leaves from a Psalter that was being copied, but there were too many mistakes here, so these were going to be redone. And this in itself implies that the date of the palimpsest Psalter is close to the date of the Hereford Gospels, because you wouldn't keep parchment just sitting unused for a long period of time. You're far more likely to reuse it straight away. What we can tell, without being able to read every word, was that the Psalter was designed on a grand scale. It was designed to be read from a distance. It wasn't designed for personal use by an individual so much as to be read in public. You can see that the scale of the writing is bigger than that of the overwriting of the Hereford Psalter, the Hereford Gospel itself. But in fact, the space between the lines and the height of the letters of the Psalter is almost unmatched in early insular, early British manuscripts. There are only 3 surviving manuscripts that have as big lettering, and those are the Lichfield Gospels, the MacRagle Gospels, which I showed you earlier on, and the Book of Kells. So this writing is bigger than, say, the Lindisfarne Gospels. And if we put on a page of the Lichfield Gospels, that gives you some sense of how the Hereford Psalter was spaced and set out on the page as a whole. But don't be fooled by the calligraphy. Size is one thing, quality of script is another. And in fact, whereas the Lichfield Gospels is beautifully calligraphic, the Hereford Palimpsest Psalter was rather irregular in the way that it was written. Now here we've gone back to it, and you can see here is the other incipit to a psalm, an I and an N together. And then if we look down here, even allowing for some distortion when the parchment was washed down, it's quite clear that this is not a straight line, that the scribe has sort of gone off true, and so on. Now, if we look in more detail, and what you're seeing here, and Bill will probably comment on this, Bill has accentuated the letters, he's gone over them, so that you can now see more clearly the writing in the Hereford Psalter. And what's very clear is that the lines are up and down, but also that the sizes of the letters are not consistent. This D is rather larger, nor is there regular word division. So qui recto sunt are all squashed together. Then there's a big gap, and one word corde is written with a space in the middle, as if the scribe thinks it's core, which is indeed a Latin word, and day, which is indeed a Latin word. But in fact, they need to go together as the Latin word corde, by or in the heart, for it to make sense. And again, up and down and so on. So it's not well written. It's not accurately written. And little details like this in particular, splitting into 2 what must have been one word, they don't mean that the scribe didn't know Latin, but they strongly suggest that at this point in his performance, he wasn't concentrating fully, he was copying on autopilot, or he was very tired. And in fact, you'll remember that the palimpsest leaves all come from the same area of the Psalter, and this is a typical pattern of scribal practice, that yes, you will write accurately and so on for several pages, then your concentration level declines. And if you don't take a break at that point, but push on anyway, you are likely to write a series of pages of reduced quality. And that's almost certainly what we're seeing here. It's logical to ask, is the script of the Psalter similar to that of the Hereford Gospels itself? And the answer is not really. They're generically part of the same script system, but whereas the Hereford Psalter is written in the more formal insular half uncial, you'll remember that the Hereford Gospels itself is a slightly less formal set minuscule. But beyond that, and I should also say that there are a couple of lines of insular half uncial in the Hereford Gospels. There you see them at the bottom of the display page, but they're not the same letter forms either. Now, if we go back, just to take one example, the Psalter scribe always likes a high back, straight back D, but the Gospel scribe always prefers a round back D, and that's the same whether it is his set minuscule, and again, whether it's his insular half uncial, and one can multiply these divergences. So a different grade of script and different preferences for individual letters. The closest parallel for the Psalter script in terms of irregularity, not in terms of letter forms, but in terms of how regular or irregular, rather, the space between words and the lines are, is from an Irish manuscript that ended up in St. Gallen. This is St. Gallen 51, a gospel book, and many of the same features of squashing certain words together, spacing others apart when they don't need to be, are apparent here. Now, what do we know about the localization, the provenance, the location of the Psalter? Well, obviously nothing. All we know is that it was in the place that the Hereford Gospels was in when the Hereford Gospels was being made. And we will hear about this document later today, but our earliest certain evidence for the provenance of the Hereford Gospels, i.e. where it was owned, dates from the early 11th century, and I'm just showing you the first of these documents, and you can see down here, and all the Feniers on Herefordshire, so it's a Hereford, and the document explains that it relates, how it relates to Hereford. So this is the evidence for the provenance. We know, because of the nature of the Hereford Gospels itself, sheets being reused, a fairly economically produced book, that it was somewhere where parchment and resources were sometimes in short supply. And the very fact that they used a palimpsest adds significantly to this picture, because almost no other early English books do. You reuse parchment when you really need to. And in England, because of our wonderfully damp climate, though not at the moment, of course, the grass grows, good fodder, good animals, good animal pelts are not normally in short supply. So the fact that they needed or decided to reuse a sheet for the Hereford Gospel tells us that it was a centre where parchment was not as abundant as it was in many major centres. The fact that the text in the Psalter comes from the middle of the Psalter, you'll remember it's Psalm 68 to early 70s, that tells us it was a complete Psalter that was being made. They didn't just start and break off. The fact they got that far strongly implies it was going to be finished. And as I said earlier, it implies that the Psalter and the Hereford Gospels are probably close in date. It's likely that you would recycle reject leaves soon after you've rejected them, and that therefore the Psalter was made in the same place as the Gospels. And the indication of the nature of the text of the Psalter, as well as some of the things we've heard about the Gospels themselves, strongly implies that that centre was no further east than Hereford, and was probably, in my view, further west than Hereford, so heading towards Wales or into Wales. Now, here you get another overview of the Psalter itself, giving us a nice sense of the page, and we've lost one line from the bottom of it, and a major discovery in the sense that palimpsests are so rare. Psalters from before 800 are also very rare, as I said earlier, and we've now been able to add to the corpus of them. The fact that the two, the Psalter and the Hereford Gospels, are physically joined enlarges our view of what a writing centre was like. Now, because we have so few securely localised early British manuscripts, the way scholars proceed is, if there's one like the Lindisfarne Gospels, which can be localised because of a note in it, you then look at the surviving corpus of broadly contemporary books, you look for manuscripts that resemble it, and then those are attributed to the same centre. That's fine. It's a reasonable way of working, given that there aren't many options. But we can all understand that what it creates is a construct of homogeneity. You're inevitably, if you follow that methodology, going to link together the books that look the same. So the books associated with Lindisfarne all look more or less like the Lindisfarne Gospels. There are no certainly attributable to Lindisfarne books that don't look like it. The value of the Hereford Gospels and the Hereford Psalter are that they provide an alternative model. The scripts are quite different, their grades are different, their preferences are different, and you would never associate the two books together on their physical appearance if they weren't actually linked, one embedded within the other. And it means that we should be alive to variety within writing centres as well as homogeneity. And armed with that, we can look at certain other books, and I'm showing you one from Durham. It's a gospel book that most scholars, not myself, have always said is a later confection. They've looked at these scripts and said they're too different to have been produced in one writing centre, and one writes one gospel and another writes another gospel, and the orthodoxy was, oh well, they're bits of two different gospel books that at some point in the early modern period were just bound together for convenience. I've never been convinced by this because their overall dimensions are the same and so on, and my suggestion, particularly in the light of the Hereford Gospel, Hereford Psalter model, is that we're just looking at the work of a scriptorium in which not everybody had been trained to write in exactly the same way. And that's surely a more realistic model in a society when, particularly with new foundations, people coming and going, and if you weren't a monastic foundation, if you were somewhere a secular foundation, people could come and go more freely. The broader point that comes out of the Hereford Gospels is that getting from this to that requires teamwork. And fine, I had recognised there was a palimpsest there, but that was the most that I could do myself with it until I was able to be assisted by Andy with excellent imaging capabilities and by Bill and Dave Messenger, who were able to process the images in order to reveal as much as could possibly be revealed of what was embedded within them. And then it came back to me to try and read what they sent to me. So the final word is that all of these things rely on collaboration, and what I've been presenting and what Andy's been presenting are the fruits of genuine teamwork with all the people listed on this screen. And you must forgive me for saying that, as you can see from this image, that if you collaborate in a collegial way, you get the halo of sanctity. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was marvellous. I will consider carefully the exercising of my episcopal rights to promote more official recognition of the sanctity. But I can, as a medievalist, say that was absolutely splendid as an introduction to the Gospels. And thank you to both of you for your contributions there. And well timed too, because we've got 10 minutes for questions